Welcome to the Alberta University of the Arts Inspiring Speaker Series. My name is André Plante, and I am the Vice President Academic and Provost here at AU Arts. I would first like to acknowledge the land we live in, then I'll thank our sponsor and introduce our moderator for today's event. We offer this acknowledgement as guests on Treaty 7 and as an act of reconciliation that honors the original people and stewards of this territory. Okay, good afternoon, bonjour. As I just said, my name is André. I'm French-Canadian, born in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. My hometown is just north of the Abenaki of Odanak and Wolinack at the confluence of the St. Lawrence River and the St. Francois River. I'm grateful to now live and work here at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow Rivers, Moquincy, or Calgary as it's known today. Alberta University of the Arts rests on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. To promote reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, the Tsuut'ina Sarsi, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wellesley, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all of those who live, work, create art, craft, and design on the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I would like to also acknowledge where our two speakers are broadcasting from today. Deanna Bowen joined us from Montreal, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanyen'kehá:ka and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron, Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. Karina Vernon is joining us from Toronto, the treaty lands and territories of the Mississauga of the Credit and the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. And sorry if I mispronounce anything. This talk is presented by the Illingworth Kurt Gallery with support from our sponsor, RBC Future Launch. I would like to extend a special thank you to Nura Ali, who will be moderating the discussion, but who also developed the team, the format, and most importantly, invited all the speakers for today's event. Nura, along with Deanna Bowen and Karina Vernon, have also graciously curated a reading list related to this talk that has been shared through the gallery with titles acquired by our AU Art Lindo Library. This event will be recorded and there will be time for Q&A at the end. It's now my pleasure to introduce Nura. Nura Ali is a visual artist, community organizer, and social activist living and working in Calgary, Alberta. Her multidisciplinary practice engages issues of memory, place building, displacement, and power. Nura is committed to community-oriented organizing, and for this reason became one of the founding members of the Vancouver Artists' Labor Union, a unionized workers' cooperative with a mission to transform labor practice within the arts and the cultural sector. Nura is deeply invested in strategies to dismantle oppressive structures and is keenly motivated to create welcoming, inclusive, and equitable spaces in the art world. Nura, the virtual podium is yours.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say first and foremost how excited I am for today's event and how I've been looking forward to this since I was asked to moderate this year's Inspirational Speaker Series. And I should maybe first, I'll do a land acknowledgement as well. And so as Andre said, I've come to you from Treaty 7 territory, which is Blackfoot Nation, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And in doing the land acknowledgement, I know that it can be something that feels a bit knee-jerk and routine. So I would like to take a moment to realize and acknowledge why this is so important. And for me, it's about responsibility, and it's responsibility that's twofold. The first is in acknowledging the land. We are acknowledging that the land is not a resource to be exploited or plundered for our gain, but that we actually share ties of kinship, reciprocity, and responsibility to each other and to the land that gives us, everything that allows us to have our life here. And the second is to acknowledge the responsibility that we hold as people who benefit from and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land. And as well as that, the violent genocide of Indigenous people that has been at the heart of the formation of this place that we know of as Canada. And so we hold a responsibility to be able to know and name that history and sit with what it means to be settlers of this place and what responsibilities we hold to teach ourselves about Indigenous laws and Indigenous sovereignty, and to sit at the feet of Indigenous scholars and learn everything we can so that we can all collectively move towards truly emancipatory possibilities that are not just us, mouthing things like decolonization and Indigenous rights. So that's my first thing out of the gate, is to realize that in, doing a land acknowledgement, we're acknowledging that we are responsible in several ways. So I'm just going to run through quickly how today is going to work. I'm going to do a quick introduction to our two speakers, and then I'm going to pass the floor on to our speakers for them to do a quick introduction of their practices. So for anybody who's in the room who might not know about them, they'll get to have a brief intro to how the speakers think about their own works. And then we will move on to a question period where I will be asking my questions to the speakers. And I know that I'm not going to have time to ask all the questions that I want. And we'll do an open format conversation between our two speakers. And lastly, we'll open the floor to the audience for you guys to pose any questions that you might have. So for the background to why I chose our two speakers for today and what was the motivator for today's conversation, I recently moved back to Alberta, having lived in Vancouver for a number of years. And as I moved back, I was fortunate enough to come across a research project that Ollie Frost has done, where it's something that's happened in a number of other cities where artists have gone and looked at the numbers for different artist-run centers and art spaces and seen how many times in the last 10 years those spaces have shown a Black artist. And as I came to Calgary, the numbers for Calgary were becoming apparent. And in one way, it was shocking, but in other ways, it was unsurprising. As a person of color who's trying to make my way in the art world, all of us know the different challenges and barriers that we face in finding space for ourselves in these places. And so seeing those numbers where galleries have not shown a single Black artist in a number of years, and then if they have shown one, there's a huge gap between one and the other, or for example, concurrently with the Alberta Art Biennial, how they've never shown a Black artist in their entire history, made me start to think about this idea of the erasure of Black people, and especially the erasure of Black people in the prairies, but more generally the erasure of Black people in Canada, and how where we assume this erasure to take place, as in it's something that is historical and happened in the past, but that now we've moved away from that. These various projects that artists have taken on have shown that not only is the erasure of Black people in general from Canada a historic phenomenon, but it's actually a concurrent and ongoing thing. So for thinking about this idea of the erasure of Black people from Canada, our two speakers are such a natural fit, as both of their practice practices engage in this idea in various and incredibly interesting ways. So I'm so excited that we get to have a wonderful conversation with both of them today, and I cannot wait. I'm going to do a quick intro of both of them before I pass the floor into them. So we'll start with Deanna Bowen. Deanna Bowen is a descendant of two Alabama and Kentucky-born Black Prairie pioneer families from Amber Valley and Campsite, Alberta. Bowen's family history has been the central pivot point of her autoethnographic interdisciplinary work since the early 1990s. She makes use of a repertoire of artistic gestures in order to define the Black body and trace its presence and movement in place and time. In recent years, her work has involved close examination of her family's migration and their connection to Vancouver's Hogan Valley and Black Strathcona, the old Black towns of Oklahoma, the Kansas Exodusers migration, and the Ku Klux Klan in Canada and the US. She is a recipient of the 2020 Governor General's Award for Visual and Media Arts Award and a 2018 Canada Council Research and Creation Grant, an Ontario Arts Council Media Arts Grant in 2017, and 2016 John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and the 2014 William H. Johnson Prize. Her writing, interviews, and artworks have been published in Canadian Art, the Capilano Review, the Black Prairie Archives, and Transition Magazine. Bowen is the editor of the 2019 publication, Other Places, Reflections on Media Arts in Canada. Karina Vernon is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto's Scarborough, where she researches and teaches in the areas of Canadian and Black Canadian literature, Black aesthetics, archives, and critical pedagogy, and Black Indigenous solidarities. She is the editor of the Black Prairie Archive, an anthology published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press in 2020, and a companion volume, Critical Readings of the Black Prairie Archives, which is forthcoming. She is at work on a 5-year SSHRC-funded project, Black Arts and the Aesthetics of Spatial Justice, which seeks to understand how mid-century urban renewal projects that destroy inner-city Black neighborhoods across North America gave rise to a new Black literary aesthetic. With Wilfred Seimerling, I hope that I pronounced that right, she's working on a book project on politics and the aesthetics of relation of Black Canadian cultural achievement, including writing, music, film, and visual arts. So I'm going to pass it on to our two speakers, which I think need no introduction, to give us a brief overview of their practices.
Nura, who would you like to go first?
You can go first.
Shall I just go ahead? All right. Let me just say before I begin, thank you for the invitation to this conversation. I'm really honored to be here. And thank you to Andre and you again, Nura, for those introductions and land acknowledgement. Nura, that was a real land acknowledgement, you know, thinking about, as Black folks, thinking about our responsibilities to Indigenous peoples, you know, the ongoing struggle for Indigenous people's sovereignty over their lands and how Black people, the role that Black people can play in that sovereignty movement, I think is a real conversation and a really important one to have. White supremacy wants to keep our communities apart. And I think that we are stronger in our separate but intertwined struggles if we work together. So I appreciate you beginning our conversation and thinking about those, thinking in those ways. Okay, you invited me to introduce myself, generally my research, to an audience. So I just want to begin by saying that I never meant to write a book on Black Canadian prairie literature. I never even meant to work in archives. I certainly never meant to return to the prairies of my youth, the place that I left in 1989, thinking that I would never come back. I went to graduate school actually to do a PhD on the African-American political philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois, who famously theorized the phenomenon of double consciousness for Black Americans. In 1903, Du Bois wrote, "The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world." Looking back on it now, it's ironic that I went to graduate school to think about a philosopher who wrote about being born into a world which yields no self-consciousness. For this was exactly my situation, except I didn't know it. But then again, you don't know what you don't know, especially if there's no language for what you don't know. I wasn't able then to think about the Black prairies, either as a literary field, as a geography, or even as a name for my particular experience. All of that existed behind a veil. In the introduction to my book, The Black Prairie Archives, I write about the moment I realized, all at once, what had been hidden behind a veil. So I want to share with you and with the audience what I write in my introduction, because I think it gives a good introduction to me and the impetus that motivates my work. So in my introduction, I write, "Editing this book has taken a great deal of time, but it has always been a labor of love. I was born in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, but I spent the most formative years of my life in Calgary and Olds, Alberta, between 1981 and 1989. During that time, I thought of myself and my family as anomalies rather than what we were, members of the third wave of Black migration to the Canadian prairies, a migration history that began at least as far back as 1780 and which continues in new forms today. I did not see Black Prairie or Black Canadian history represented in the school curriculum, nor acknowledged or celebrated in the Prairie's official histories or public sites of memory. And so I grew up knowing nothing of the region's Black history, nor its Black writers. There was no sign of Blackness in any of the anthologies I read that regionalized writing from the prairies, nor in any of the prairie's historical self-representations. Cheryl Fogo's important essay, "My Home is Over Jordan," suggests that encountering oneself as a historical absence in this way has been one of the hallmarks of Black prairie life. She writes, "I grew up inside a history that had no official status and a community that had no geographical place. Our story was casually and precariously preserved, kept alive more by word of mouth amongst ourselves than by any canonical record or acknowledgement of our presence." Fogo's, for me, her quotation encapsulates sort of the collective experience of the prairies. And I think particularly for us, maybe what I can characterize as third wavers, you know, those whose families arrived not as part of a broader wave of migration. You know, my family came in 1981, just my family, right? And we landed in Calgary and then moved to Olds. And so, you know, I thought, oh, we're the only ones. But even for those folks like Cheryl Fogo, who knows that her family came as part of a wave of migration, still for her experiencing herself as a historical absence in the archival record became sort of a foundational aspect of experience. So this was my situation. Then 2 months into my doctoral program, a seemingly chance encounter in the library profoundly altered not only the direction of my research, but also of my life. Wandering among the stacks of McPherson Library at the University of Victoria, I was drawn to a particular shelf of histories about the region where I had grown up. Though I had left Alberta in 1989 determined to never go back, You know, it had been a really tough place for a mixed race Black teenager. I found myself now drawn to these books by an unknown but urgent intention. One of the titles on the shelf was William Francis Butler's 19th century travelogue, Wild North Land, which documents the young British Army captain's travels from Fort Garry in present-day Manitoba to Fort St. John in present-day British Columbia. As I flipped to the middle of the book, my gaze was arrested by one of the pages. In 1873, Butler recorded, matter-of-factly, and without any trace of irony or surprise, witnessing a Black paddler sailing down the waters of the Peace River. On April 20th, 1873, Butler wrote, "One fine day, a canoe came floating down the lonely river. It held a solitary Negro, a pioneer, cook, trapper, vagrant, idler, or squatter as chance suited him." Reading this passage, I was stunned. You know, the image of a paddler inside a canoe places Blackness inside the very icon of a particular kind of Canada, one that links the nation to the wilderness and to the fantasy of white settler indigeneity, but rarely, if ever, to Blackness. Like most people at the time, until I read this passage, I had believed that Blackness on the prairies was a mid to late 20th century phenomenon, a part of my own cultural moment, even though I had grown up within a few hours' drive of the largest all-Black communities to ever exist west of Ontario. Until this moment, the Black Prairie's history and its literary archive existed only as an absence for me. So unearthing this letter in a book in the library that day, I realized two key things: that an archive, a literary archive exists, a Black archive exists, but that it would take time and effort to recover it. You know, the material lies in out of the way museums and historical societies, or in agricultural journals, or in restricted family archives. And so it was going to take some effort to draw it all together. Second, I realized, though, that this writing was really radical from both a literary and a historical perspective, because it challenges the literary in a number of ways, and also because it reinserts Blackness into a regional space that has been almost completely overdetermined as white. So in the days following my discovery, I returned to the library and began looking through every anthology of prairie writing that I could find, looking through histories of the prairies, looking for any sign of this, something that would explain the presence of this Black fur trader in the 1870s in the space that we now call Alberta. And looking through these books, I found virtually nothing, meaning that at the same time as I sort of discovered the Black presence on the prairies, I also discovered the repression of it. And so I realized that the fact that I had no language to think the Black prairies, I had no language to think about the Black prairies as a geography, as a literary field, or even as a term that named my particular experience, that was not accidental. That was an effect of the prairie's regional discourses that had hidden these terms from me. So I spent the next 15 years of my life traveling to libraries and archives and historical societies across the prairies, as well as searching on online databases for anything that I could find written by anyone who may or may not have identified as Black or as a prairie person. And what I found was a rich and expansive archive, including songs, oral literature, newspaper editorials, recipes, letters, poetry, speeches, novels, rap. An archive that ultimately puts pressure on each one of the terms that I use, Black, Canadian, Prairie, and Archive. Inherited knowledge about each one of these terms conceives them as boundaried, discrete, and stable phenomena. But the archive I unearthed demands that we think in different ways about what Blackness is or can be. For instance, it demands that we think about Black, Indigenous identities, and to think in far more expansive ways about what the prairies are, what its archive of literature is and means, which brings us to our conversation today with Nura and Deanna.
So wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. And now I can pass the floor on to Deanna.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Karina, for that fabulous setup. But also your very important and intimate conversation around how you came to do this work. And I want to thank you for doing the work as a descendant from a family that comes out from a community that is very much spoken to in your book, in Black Prairie Anthology. And so as a descendant, your book is the book that I couldn't write, but I'm very glad that my work is in that and that our stories are in that. As a descendant, my work was other than that. That was not the thing that I could do with the information that I have. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what I do with the information that I have, but somewhere in there, I know that my grandparents wanted to have this story told and taught. And so I deeply appreciate that you have crafted the book that will do that. So thanks. I started this whole thing and said that I wasn't going to share my screen, but I lied. So I'm going to try. It's a bit of a longer slide presentation, but I'm going to skip around and just tell you a story about how my family's history, my grandfather, his migration, Reverend Albert Risby, people in Alberta, northern Alberta will certainly know the name. Came from Campsie, Alberta, which is no longer there. It's now kind of a hamlet that has tucked into, oh my gosh, I had it right on my tip of my tongue. It'll come back, Barhead. And my grandmother is a descendant that comes from Amber Valley. My great grandfather, Willis Bowen, brought the family from Indian Territory, now understood to be Oklahoma. They left in the 1909s, 1910s, and got to Alberta and Canada, to Western Canada first, and then ultimately settled in Amber Valley in 1910-11. And my great grandfather was the postmaster for the first 40 some odd years. So I want to speak from that place. And so ironically enough, all of my work actually comes from, I won't be showing slides, so it doesn't look like I can actually do it. But anyhow, I'll tell you a story. My work all comes from a very intimate and originally unknown kind of place. It was questions I didn't have answers to. I didn't even know what the questions were at the beginning, so much as I needed to understand who my family was. And I came up in downtown Eastside Vancouver in a particularly, I think, rough and tumble kind of a context. And the early work that I did was grounded in trying not to be like my family, ironically enough, right? And then the work kind of evolved into a retracing. The only way you can kind of know what you want to be or come into what you want to be is by knowing where you come from. And so the work has been about 20 odd years of literally taking my family's geographical information, their birth certificates, all of that kind of archival data, and using it to map their bodies in time and place. So literally mapping it back to the plantations that my family has worked on, going back even to the indigenous communities that were also in that land. And then by nature of that, I've been doing this work of tracing this diaspora that just happens, this Afro-Indigenous diaspora that follows the Trail of Tears alongside all of these other indigenous peoples that have been displaced from the Deep South and then moved into Indian Territory and then onto other places. And so the other place that my family came to is first British Columbia and then ultimately to Campsie, Alberta and Amber Valley. The work I do is particularly resonant to right now in that what I was originally trying to source was whether or not the Ku Klux Klan had burned my family's belongings to the ground as they came into Athabasca. And it's, of course, given that the Ku Klux Klan is an individual organization of such, I mean, they do have their very public moments. For the most part, you never see them. So my ambition to prove that the Klan had anything to do with that ended up with really nothing. I mean, a lot of works over the last 15 years that do the job of laying out the context in which my family lived in and the likelihood and very real presence of the Klan in all of the places that they've lived. The practice has, at best, I've only ever been able to approximate with a very kind of measured good guess that in fact it was the Klan. So the work has then taken me to different places. I wasn't really looking to be an artist that was doing artistic work about the Ku Klux Klan, but it became the necessary work to speak to the things that my family didn't want to speak to, the traumas that they had swallowed, the traumas that my community had endured before they ever got to Canada. And right now, my research is just now digging into the Afro-Indigenous standoffs between white settlers in Indian Territory, literally the violence that spurred their movement. I think why it matters, why I do this work also, it's a bit of a compromise. And so Karina, when I was talking to you about your book, the deal that I made with my family, my ancestors, was that I would make art because it's the tool that I had. It's what I had access to at the time. And it was the thing I knew how to do best. So the deal I cut with them in my head was I will continue to do this research because it's really difficult, but I will do it as long as I can do it with art. And so what I've been doing for the last 20 years is making use of all of the gallery conventions, everything from the e-invite to the newsletter to the exhibition space itself, the process of production, every single aspect of staging an exhibition, I have learned to co-opt as a means to publish what I think is outsider information related to Blackness in Canada, erasure of Black people, particularly the oppression of my family in its specificity, but then how that opens into, wonderfully, curiously enough, a roadmap to mapping an invisible community of white supremacist imperial peoples across the nation. The cornerstone of the work, for all of the work I've been producing for the last 15 years, is a reproduction of a petition that was generated when my family came to Alberta, created by boards of trade, by oh goodness, if I wasn't trying to make Frank Oliver. There's a lot of names up here, sorry. Frank Oliver was immigration officer at that time, and he wrote some incredibly offensive, racist, murderous policy. One of the things that he spearheaded was this petition that was it worked out to be a document about 36 pages or so, 4,300 signatures. And that's a significant population in 1911. But it's a document that says that if the government, the Laurier government doesn't come in and interfere, that they would be obliged to resort to other methods, inferring lynch mobs that would kill Black people. the blessing of that document, as if you could imagine that there being one, is that if you read that document as a roadmap, as literally a map of people, of like-minded people, who are willing to sign a document in consensus to this notion of killing Black people, then in many ways you could argue that that petition is a roadmap to mapping a community of white supremacists or otherwise. So that's honestly, it's a perverse opportunity of using that petition as honestly a roadmap to some of the most significant people in Canada's cultural history. Not to kind of belabor it anymore, but to say that that petition has led me wonderfully to the opportunity right now that I'm researching, which is a roadmap of all of those players those Alberta players as they relate to literally the making of the National Gallery, Queen Victoria, Empire, and other. And so I think all that to say, and I'll stop here, that the work of avenging my family has led me to a place where I think that I've got the scholarship, and through archival research, I have all the receipts to undo the Canadian cultural narrative of everything. And that is extraordinarily powerful and a hoot, really, to be able to make use of the, how should I put it, the debris of racist policy and be able to use it to subvert the nation. And I'll stop there.
Two amazing introductions, and definitely setting the groundwork for hopefully a very rich conversation today. And I think that, yeah, this is a very important point of how, you know, in Canada, I think that there is this ongoing fallacy that somehow Canada is exempt from the violent enactment of white supremacy, as though the Klan just finishes at the border and Canada is the end of the Underground Railroad and Black people are just like welcomed with open arms into here. So hearing all these stories is, I think, incredibly crucial and necessary, especially right now when, you know, we're going through all of this, I suppose, what would you call this, a racial moment. And Canada has a lot of things to grapple with in terms of its own racist histories. Okay, so I'm gonna do my first question. And I have like 15 questions, so I know that I'm not gonna get to all of them. And because of time constraints, I'm also going to do my question as a two-parter. So I'm just gonna be a bit sneaky, but they're connected. And also they're a bit long, so but there is a point in there buried somewhere. So I was going to ask you both a question through another person who is totally unconnected to both of your works, and I think that I told you guys about him a little bit. So just for people in the room who might not know him, the person that I'm thinking of is a musician, virtuoso, legend called Rashawn Roland Kirk. And he is a jazz musician from the 70s, although he actually, he doesn't like the term jazz musician, and he prefers to call himself a Black classical musician, which I also really love. But he's so incredible in so many different ways. But one of the things that he's like more sensationally known for is the fact that he can play multiple instruments simultaneously. So he's able to play like a trombone and a clarinet and a saxophone at the same time. Sometimes with like both his mouth and his nose. He's just insane. But the first question about him is that not only was he, you know, this incredible genre-pushing avant-garde musician, but he was also deeply committed to fighting against the erasure of Black creatives and Black people from public culture and like collective memory. And so he spent a lot of his life collecting stories of different people working within the jazz industry, but also in Black blues and all these other sort of like genres of music to both fight the idea of, you know, the whiteness of American music, and then, you know, all the other white musicians who come and steal Black creative content. And he's like trying to give credit to the people who did it. So I was thinking about this idea of, memory keepers and people who are essentially living archives, and the roles that they play in sharing these stories that are not recorded in the official histories, and what kind of a role somebody who is that kind of, somebody called him once a memory entrepreneur, which I really love as, as a concept in and of itself. And so thinking about that idea of cultural memory keepers alongside how Saidiya Hartman talks about her use of archives, and she coined this term. She says that is for her a labor of regard. So it's like this very intimate way of looking where, you know, if in the official archives, Black people appear only as, you know, points of excellence or as criminals. And, you know, the ways that Black people, you know, like who are not exceptional people, who are ordinary people, the only way that they come into these official archives are through, you know, police, you know, records, or like sociologists or anthropologists who only see them in this very limited way. And how if you're a Black archivist coming in, trying to look for ordinary lives, you have to kind of do that labor of regard, that labor that's slow and intimate and looks through and behind and between all of these official stories that you're getting of that Black body that you're seeing in this archive. And then the second part of the question was linked to the fact that Rashawn was also born, no, he wasn't born. He, when he was a baby in the hospital, a nurse accidentally administered eye drops. And so he became blind as a consequence. And so he would make his bandmates rehearse in the dark. And so I've just been thinking about that idea so much recently, and thinking about this idea of, you know, in the dark, being able to play these instruments simultaneously and hold these disparate threads in tandem. And I know this is a bit romantic, but I was thinking that maybe it is because he's playing in the dark that he's able to escape the linearity of a single instrument and get into that space of liminality and sort of like the imaginative possibilities of the dark. And so the second part of the question is, what kind of work do you guys think can be done in the dark? Oh, you're both muted.
Juicy. Oh my gosh. That's so inviting. I don't know which one to answer first. Karina, are you okay if I go? Yeah? Okay. Memory keepers. Yes, I would say definitely. I have started to describe myself as, or describe what I do as aggressive remembering, aggressive remembering. And making a point of clarifying that I don't inherently think that the work is political. Not that there is anything wrong with political work, but I think it's important that we kind of check that kind of accepting those categorizations for doing things that white people get to do all the time, like aggressively remembering through every holiday, through every monument, through, you know, so there's a practice. And so this idea of remembering my family's history and researching the broader kind of Black, Afro-Black context that they're in, that is, while I often take that position of it being interventionist, again, at the end of the day, it is a process of remembering that is akin to all of the other things that happen within the white mainstream canon. There is nothing exceptional to this labor, and I think that that's important. And then I think the second thing is I'm working, because we talk about this absence of the Black body in the archive, certainly an absence of access to the archive, the absence of ability to construct an archive, then what I find myself obliged to do to tell my family's stories is I'm obliged to make use of white archives that tell our stories in deeply inaccurate ways. But, you know, because white people think that they're white art people within institutions think they're talking to other white people, what they have done is also explicitly clear. So I make use of that material in predominantly white Canadian cultural spaces, and I bring that material out and rearrange it as my family recalls it. So it's reorganizing, researching around these archives, and telling the other story, the story that does get omitted, the Black story that's on the other side of those white images. That's kind of what I'm very much thinking about. And then using this, doing this strategy within a gallery context where you know a white run gallery is going to document itself for funding, for institutional, all of those curatorial, legacies, all of that. For all of those reasons, they will document whatever I present in a space, which then kind of adds to the history, and it obliges the system to record my family's history and their story and the white supremacist story that surrounds them, right? So that's what I imagine about the notion of memory keeping. Karina, do you want to jump in with memory keeping, and then we can go back to the other one? Okay, so I'll leave it there. Yeah, I think that you can. I think that that's how I'm doing the memory keeping.
For sure. Before I answer Nura's question, I just want to respond to what you said, Deanna. After I introduced my work, the really beautiful, generous words that you shared about my book, my work. And I just want to say thank you. I was so nervous about publishing this book. I felt such a deep responsibility to not, mess it up, to not mess it up, because I'm telling people's stories, right? And I'm telling family members' stories. And, all of us speak from a very particular place, right? So I speak from my own third wave, immigrated from Honduras in 81, like that is my story. And so my view on the Black prairies comes from that place. And so I was really, really nervous about, am I doing this work? Am I doing these memories and this history justice? And I really felt the burden of it, which is part of why it took me so long to get the book out, And so I was really, so what you say just means a lot to me. So thank you for that. And that connects to your question, Nura, about memory keepers. Public memory, collective memory on the prairies is damaged. It's damaged and it's damaging. It damages people to exist in a social context that is so riddled with collective amnesia about Black history, right? And so people grow up not knowing their own history. And I'm not only talking about Black folks, although I think it's particularly damaging for us to exist in a context where our history is, has been violently absented from collective memory. But I think it damages all of us who grow up without a benefit of understanding our rich history, which means that the current conversations that we are having about Black Lives Matter and anti-Blackness and policing Black lives, those conversations exist without the context, the historical context. All of Deanna's work talking about, the policing of Black lives that has happened since Black folks have been on the prairies. We need those stories, right? We need those stories to understand where we are now. And so the work of knowledge keepers, and I'm thinking about Deanna's work, and I'm thinking about people like Crystal Mays in Saskatchewan, and I'm thinking about Cheryl Fogo's work, and I'm thinking about Junetta Jamerson and that community's work in Alberta. All of the work that they do is justice work. I think memory work is justice work because they are seeking to not only offer correctives to the damaged public memories, but that is anti-racist work, right? That's justice work on the prairies. And so that is crucial work, and their work has enabled all of my work. Without what they did, without, you know, what they did is just, sometimes I think about how phenomenal, how much faith and trust and how much they loved their own families, right? That they carefully documented and kept all of the documents related to their families, stories of migration and perseverance and, you know, all of that. They kept it all, despite what the dominant culture was saying about the value of their families and the value of those lives, right? They went and interviewed elders and recorded it and published these books that are just treasure troves, right? That's justice work right there. And the fact that they did that work of, you know, loving Black folks' lives, right? Then that enabled the future work, the work that I'm doing, then the work, you know, that's going to come after me. So much depends on those beautiful knowledge keepers, that effort. And so much of that effort was taken without a paid job or, you know, like without the resources to do it. So I'm just eternally indebted and grateful. And they're women, right? It's mostly the women who have been doing this work. So just hands up to those women who have done that work. Then there's your other question about what kind of work can we do in the dark? Maybe do we want to go back to Deanna for that, or should I keep talking? I'll keep talking. What an amazing question. What kind of work can be done in the dark? Well, that speaks to me because I feel like I do a lot of my work in the dark because I often don't know what I'm looking for, right? I don't know what I'm looking for, and often what I think I'm looking for isn't there. So one of the things that I grapple with constantly in my work when I go into the archives is the absences. So when I don't see, you know, what I assembled is a textual archive of writing, but I'm so aware of all the cultural production that doesn't make it into archives. And you invited us to think, Nura, through the life work of a musician. And so thinking about music, for instance, and voice, and the way a body moves, performs, gestures, all of that is cultural production. Dance, right? Shouts, songs, prayers, all of that that doesn't make it into the archive, but is part of our lives, right? Part of Black life and part of the beauty of Black life, right? So a lot of my current thinking has to do with how do I approach that, I guess, darkness in the archive? And how do I make it visible, and how do I materialize things that are fundamentally immaterial? I don't have full answers for that right now, but I guess I'll just say that that's what I'm working on lately. You know, there's cowboy songs and campfire songs and all of that stuff. So I guess I'm just going to be writing around the way Saidiya Hartman writes and the way other scholars of the Black Atlantic write around those lives. That's what I will do. I'll put writing to it. Anyway, that's me.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What can you make in the dark? I think everything. I think you can make everything out of this darkness. One of the blessings about being an invisible Black Canadian when you go to the States to do research is they don't see you coming because you are not, they don't know what to do with you, right? Because you're not their idea of Blackness. And I've got the best intel out of that invisibility. I have got to tell you, it is such a it's like Harry Potter and like the invisibility cloak. It's awesome, right? You can get all kinds of goods. But also truthfully, like, you know, having to I mean, the reality of making art in Canada about Blackness has required, for it to take hold, as I think it has, it's required the foundational kind of building of an understanding of what Black art looks like, and then from there, kind of making pathways into institutions and curatorial conversations about, we need to be talking about the distinction of, and there's a blessing in there being no roadmap here, in my mind. And again, this is me always looking for the silver lining in the absence, right? And that's maybe one could say that is something that comes out of this darkness, is an incredibly kind of fertile imagination and a way to figure out how to become visible quickly, right? Because that's also in here too, right? We are a generation that also wants to see ourselves. And so there's also something about figuring out how to address the darkness, but make something out of nothing, and then come out of the darkness, so to speak, if that makes any sense at all. But again, without a visual history, or with a scant visual history within contemporary art, I truly believe that one can do anything, because you're not working against anything. Or if one chooses to work against, by example, Black American culture, which ironically, as we all know, is necessary in talking about Black Canadian experience, right? You can use that too as an opportunity to create something new, right? Truthfully, in my practice, my ambition is to research and undermine white nationalist Canada to the point of destruction of the cultural narrative to the ground. Rubble is what I want. Not to be over boastful, but I do believe the more that we bring these stories, these seemingly insignificant stories, out from the dark, when we start listening to the things that my grandmother said, my mother, as the secretary to a succession of white men who didn't think she heard anything, but thinking about these stories of these folks, these Black folks that have been around white folks who don't see them, but these Black folks who have heard and seen things and have stories to tell. And those stories, I truly believe, are the things that will tear down the master's house. If you want to get into like the nitty gritty of that power, right? There's a reason we don't have access, and it's part of it is because we have so much that we know, right? It's another way to kind of look at this. There's an extraordinary wealth, a world full of counterintelligence, literally, in our lives, in our families' lives. And I think that if we mobilize them, even if it's from teaching my students to go ask their parents about where they come from, to a work in a public institution that rewrites something effectively. I just truly believe that going back, all of these racialized and indigenous kids going back and talking to your parents and finding out what the story is and asking your grandparents, that's the stuff that will move mountains. We are an extraordinary community of intelligent, bright, creative, visionary people. And I just think that we have to tap back into our own Blackness. If you want to call that dark, sure. But again, it's just about the wealth and that Black resource and that Black gold, so to speak. Yeah.
I love that distinction, that it's not about trying to reform or rehabilitate this national narrative. It's tear it all down. We have to know these stories so that we can start on an even footing, and that we're not just, how can you fix something that's you're totally in denial about? It's that James Baldwin quote that says, not everything that is faced can be fixed, but something that is never faced can never be fixed, or something along those lines. I think I'm paraphrasing him poorly, but yeah, there was that. Because I think this is something that I've heard quite often in recent conversations, particularly surrounding George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, is that, it's almost this impression that it's Black people who have this obsession with racism, that we can't let it go. Like, it happened in the past, like, get over it, or get over yourself almost. and you'd be like, you know, I would be happy to never talk about race ever again. You know, I'd be happy to never mention this ever again. But the sheer realities of our lives don't allow us that possibility. And so until they're fixed, we're going to be in everyone's faces about it and talking about it and bringing it up. So, but I have another question that ties back into sort of like how you guys think about archives, and it's kind of part of the the original first part of the two-parter about this idea of excavating these stories that, you know, if Black people don't come into archives unless they go through sort of, you know, interactions with official governments, you know, whether that's, you know, through various institutions, or they come into it through, you know, just having some sort of distinction as, you know, some sort of exceptional person, you know, like Louis Armstrong will have his archive, or, you know, Eartha Kitt, or people who are like anomalies. And so when you guys are trying to find these stories of, say, your example, your family, Deanna, or Karina, other, you know, Black Prairie archive, Black Prairie bodies in the archive, how do you go about doing that intermediate reading? You know, like if this Black person comes into your idea, like, you know, that Black canoeist coming down the river, and the Black canoeist seen through the you know, the filter of that white writer and positioned in a certain way, how do you then, as, you know, both writers and artists, do that excavating to find the real person behind that stat, or that, you know, the official version, you know, the Black person who's been through that filter of whiteness?
Oops, Karina, do you mind if I go? I'll give you one example. Probably a couple, but one right now is part of the reason I'm able to kind of travel around the white social elite community that it makes up Alberta, and then ultimately the Canadian cultural circle, white Canadian cultural circle, is through their patronage and the works that they gift to institutions. And so, is this the story I want to tell you? No, well, yeah, I'll tell it for a different reason. It's an example of a painting by a gentleman who's a horrible painter, and his work was gifted to an institution in Ontario. And it's a painting of a Black woman, and it's just god awful ugly. It's horrible. It's horrible. But and it's horrible to the extent that I could not possibly put it out in the world, because he clearly didn't think anything of her, and I just can't reclaim it. But specific to context, I know the woman's name, of the woman that's portrayed, and because I don't want the image to go out in the world, I then looked at the patrons who gifted the painting to the institution. And so that's this other kind of layer of investigative work that comes out of the practice as well. This is a perfect example of evidence of a Black body that was in a circle of white people as a model, but you don't know anything else about her. But in that absence, I was able to trace out the patron, and then the patron's history, and then to understand the very elite circles that they circled in, and then ultimately just kind of kept doing a genealogical dig around these individuals to see who they hung with, who they associated with, and then found myself smack dab in the middle of a eugenics society listing. And then it's like, that's kind of how that happens, but it's just like working with the existing information that's there that leads you to these other things, right? So that's an example of how white nationalism, it comes out of the woodwork, so to speak. Blackness, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous history, that's harder, and often grounded in zero archive, or even zero family information. And that has been, Afro-Indigeneity has been the harder thing to trace in this whole community, for a variety of reasons. So archival newspapers, if I know a date, I can start from there and see who's who. I can work from census records. I can work from a whole bunch of other things that are seemingly unconnected in order to kind of excavate. So it could be a phone book. One person that I located that was like the holy grail between the plantation that our family was enslaved on, and Amber Valley, was a woman who was kind of on the outs with the community in Amber Valley, and because she, cussed and swore and all this, and she was like a total badass. But she had a photograph at the bottom of her steamer trunk, and that photograph was the thing that had us all going down south to go to the plantation and all that kind of stuff. And all of that came out of a conversation with this chick who doesn't hang with the rest of the church going community. And that was just the best thing ever. Honestly, you find it in the most unusual ways. Or the librarian who at the Toronto Reference Library who got moved from his favorite section to the newspaper section and was pissed and told me all the trade secrets. And so like there's just that's how you get this stuff. You flip the dreadlocks a little bit and you kind of that's horrible to say, but also part of the game, right? That's somewhat how I do it. Also a very close reads of bibliographies and stuff like that to find what other people have found as well. That's a very short and flip answer to that, but there's more to it, but you get the gist.
So if I understand your question, Nura, you're asking about, how do you read archives and recover ordinary life, right? How do you recover the ordinary stories of Black life in the archives? That's a really interesting question. So the way that I approached archives was that I was completely open to finding anything, any kind of document. So, I'm a literature scholar, but I think that what I do is write literary histories. So I'm interested in reading all kinds of documents as literature and history both. So when I went into the archives, I was completely open to finding anything, whether that was a letter or, what they call ephemera in archival studies, things that, things that usually don't make it into the archival record because they're kind of unusual or ordinary kind of documents. I was interested in all of that. And that luckily enables me to see to have access to those lives and to have access to those moments of people's lives that normally wouldn't make it into a historical record or a dominant kind of archive. So when I think about, for instance, finding Mildred Ware's letters in the Glenbow Museum and Archives, these are letters that Mildred Ware wrote to get her family brand registered, which enabled me to see something about Mildred's life. She becomes the first Black prairie writer because she wrote these letters and paid $1 to have her family brand registered. And because I was interested in reading Martha Edwards' oral testimony about her journey from the United States to Alberta when she was really a teenager. She was like in her late teens. And then she tells us a story about what it was like to be an unmarried, single Black girl traveling by herself on the train for the first time across an international boundary, right? And she's telling about arriving in this settlement where, there's hardly anybody there. There's her husband, there's another family. She gives birth to the first baby in the new settlement. She doesn't have anything to dress the baby in. So you get these stories of an ordinary Black life, but these stories then challenge our dominant ways of telling history in some really important ways. You know, you get the point of view of a young Black girl and what matters in her life, you know, and that is actually huge because it challenges our dominant way of telling history, whose lives matter, right? And so, and then, you know, those voices are raised to the status of, you know, like historically important people. Yeah, so it turns our Canadian history telling sort of upside down. And so I'm grateful to those people for, you know, creating those materials and sharing their stories with us now. So-called ordinary, but really, really necessary stories.
I could add to that to say, I think listening for the silences in the archive are also super important. The things that don't get said in a transcript or oral history that seem odd. And I will say, you know, specific to my family, it was the absence of a discussion or Karina had published, did you include Willa Dallard's? No, yes, no?
I wasn't able to.
No, right, okay. Willa Dallard is my great aunt, my grandmother's older sister, and she published an oral history that told her the story of how my family came across to Canada. And she talks about how, you know, how the good things and the bad things about the experience, but then she makes this mention of a fire. And it's the curiosity of the mention of the fire and how it's not embellished in any way, but it's mentioned. And the silence around that fire was honestly the first thing that got me thinking about the Klan and why you wouldn't get into the details about that fire and why there's, well, I mean, obviously with the Klan in any kind of time frame, you're obviously not going to be going around pointing fingers at how it happened, who did it, all those things. But it was the absence of embellishment that actually got me on a whole track about the Ku Klux Klan, because, you know, so the way that played out was, okay, this fire, right? So let me go to the newspapers of the time to see if there's any accounts of a fire. And then you realize that there isn't. And then you go from there and you start asking bigger questions about what's happening in the region in that time politically, you know, any kind of number of things that lead from that silence. So that's kind of an example of that. I also, truthfully, I know I've talked about it before, but I sat down for 3 days with my mom in 2011 and we just drove around the city and she took me to all the places that she could remember where she lived. And we just recorded all of it. And that 3-day conversation turned into a transcript for a body of work that I've been producing since 2011. Everything that I have been making is somehow connected to that interview in some way. And why I kind of highlight that, because we're talking about a secretary who worked for some white people in City Hall and then saw some things and worked for a judge, and you know how she got that job moving from a speakeasy, the Black nightclub in Vancouver, and going from that job to being turned down for a job, and then my grandmother pulling out a business card about meeting a man that happens to have a connection to the City Hall. Like my mom's telling of that story and the people that she was around is so rich. And it's, again, like a class of Black people that are really, for the most part, unconsidered, certainly. And their memories of their everyday lives of answering the phone and all that kind of stuff would seem to be insignificant. But the stories, the crazy, ridiculous stories my mom told me, all were true. Speaking of it, but you know, they reflect a time that I don't recognize. But researching around everything she said, what has worked out to be the most extraordinary kind of bounty of information. So I know I'm kind of probably hitting it over their head too much, but those conversations with your kin are everything. Often completely flying against everything that's in a white Western archive or any of those kinds of things. But that's where the sleuthing comes in, and that's where the bounty is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I mean, yeah, because I think that oral histories and living archives is something that definitely cannot be stressed enough, because it's where you find these Black bodies are not just these symbols of desire or symbols of fear, but they're actually living human beings with motivations and whatever's and then also that they're able to narrate their lives in a way that is first person, and that they're not, just sort of trudged out in the service of romance, as Sadie Hartman says, that they're actually breathing, living people. And so I think that, yeah, I'd be so curious to see this interview with your mom. I can feel already its richness and its weightiness.
The interview itself has been made into 2 works. One is a 20-minute section of an audio recording that was put into a show called Harlem Nocturne, and then the other is that I literally published that. Perfect bound that interview and put the book in the exhibition as well as a redacted document, because there are still people that were still alive that my mom is a gossip as well. So some of that information had to be kept, back. But the idea also of putting a redacted archive out into the world to protect Black people is also something super interesting to consider as well.
Because there are some things that are not meant for everybody.
Exactly. But I think it is also important for people to know that it exists, right?
Yeah. I just noticed the time, so I'm going to stop asking my questions, and I'm going to move on to some of the questions that we have coming in. There's lots of questions. Let me see what I can do. I haven't been looking at the questions because I've been so just following you guys. Okay, let's see. Why don't, do you guys have one question for each other by any chance while I find us a question in the chat? Do you guys have any burning questions for each other? Oh, Deanna.
I just have more. I have more of an apology to Karina, because I really was trying really hard to broker an oral history to get it into her book, and I couldn't work the family magic in time. And so, funny enough, I wanted you to know that once the book came out and they saw what it was about, they were like, "Oh my God, there should be another one, and it should be." And I'm like, but I tried to get you to, yeah. So I know it was a weird process, but I just tried it. It goes in ebbs and flows of agreeing or not.
You know what? I think those lessons are extremely important for people who work in archives. As Nura just said, that not everything is necessary. Not every story is for the public archive.
Yeah.
Some stories are family stories and are not for public consumption, and I respect that. I guess that's the other lesson, that what you see in a published sort of archive, or like the one that I put out, is in some ways the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stories that don't make it in there, things that I wanted to publish but couldn't get permission to publish. But obviously, the archivist has to understand that not everything, there's a reason that some stories need to be kept back, right? So I completely understand that. Yeah.
I was so I wanted it to happen. Oh, anyhow. I'm glad that you understood that.
For sure.
I did notice a couple of questions in the chat. Hi, Alice. I'm glad you're out there. Alice Jim, all the way out here in Montreal with me. And she asks about Black Joy in the archive. Sometimes I do. My work is usually fairly dark. I mean, by nature of what it is that I'm looking at, it's often fairly dark, but I do see lovely things every once in a while. I aspire, not horrible, I aspire to make a happy work. It's a fantasy. And then at the same time, I appreciate the power of Black joy and the need to see Black joy, and to encourage makers to, find language, creative language to articulate what Black joy is. I think that that's super important. The work that I'm doing is not that, but it's doing another kind of difficult body of work that also is, a polar opposite to the notion of joy. And I think we need to know all of these various states to understand what joy and freedom are in many ways, if that makes sense. I find extraordinarily beautiful. I find beauty in a considerable amount of dark material, all that at the same time. And I think that that is so far the best that I can do. And I feel a sense of time and pressure and responsibility to work on the opportunities that I've been given now and work on the knowledge that I have. And so right now, I'm not producing works about joy, but it is something that I wish for and am somewhat jealous of in other people and their ability to do it. It's just not my time.
Well, I just want to say, like, as someone who has found joy in your work, I think there's like different types of joy that we can find. Because yes, there's the joyful joy, but there's also the joy that comes from when you are consistently gaslit that this is not happening, this is all in your head, it's just up to you to try harder, and that, all of these things will be accessible to you if you just did something different. And then to see your work and know the history, there's a sense of joy that comes from finally having what you know in your heart and your gut put out there. There's a joy in that too.
Bittersweet though.
Yes, it's 100%. It's good though.
But it's important.
Like that validation that you're not crazy.
Yeah.
That what you sort of like your spidey senses told you to be true is in fact even more true than you could have imagined.
Yeah, so that's good.
There's a bitter joy in that too.
There's a lot of joy in the archives because there's a lot of relationships, right? There's a lot of the documents are to do with family relationships, children, partnerships, the creation of community, right? And just thinking about the migration that Deanna's family is connected to, and even before that, those folks that came out onto the prairies before it was the prairies, the ranchers, the farmers, the sojourners, the fur traders, and then the Oklahoma migration, those folks were freedom seekers. They were looking to establish another way of being on the prairies. Whether that was possible or not possible is another story, but the impetus behind their stories is freedom seeking, right? And so the kind of subtext to all of the writing is that unfinished quest for Black freedom, which is I don't know if joy is the right thing, but it is that, full-hearted quest for another possibility, right? And so hope. I experienced hope, right? I experienced a tremendous amount, I don't know, again, joy, but I experienced this heart uplifting feeling just engaging with these many different stories. They don't always, as Deanna says, like they are also stories of struggle. But the fact that people put pen to paper, right, or recorded their elders, right, there's even a lot of hope and optimism. It's such a future-oriented gesture to write, right, or to record your ancestors. That is a gift to the future. That is a trust that there is life, right, a tomorrow. So that's an incredibly hopeful gesture that carried me along the work.
Yeah, it's like hopeful and resolute. But then also it's like, yeah, this idea of even hoping for better than life teaches you should expect is that tiny revolutions in minor key, as Saidiya Hartman calls it, that there is these constant micro revolutions happening. Even, you know, a young Black woman traveling by herself across international lines, it's revolutionary for a woman to do that at all, let alone this young Black woman to do it. And so, yeah, I definitely can see how you would feel so buoyed up by that desire for better. You know, there's one question right at the end that I'm just going to add to. It says, has working in restoring and presenting the histories of your personal families and of Black people in Canada affected the way that you document your everyday lives in the present? Are you guys archiving yourselves?
By nature of my practice, yes. So, you know, as a practicing artist who creates bodies of work for presentation and potentially representation, I've been archiving the ephemera that goes into the making of a show and the show itself. There are exhibitions that are traveling right now, so that, you know, those will be, funny enough, now that I have a commercial practice, those things are objects that have commercial value, so they'll be cared for and archived, and there's a whole bunch of stuff about provenance and all that kind of stuff that I'm learning about. So every move that those works make, there is something that's going to go into an archive. But again, that was the ambition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I would say about that. Yeah.
But this is more like in your
every day. What true story. When I got the Governor General, the woman that nominated me is a woman named Vera Frankel, and she only works in permanent ink because she has got all of these awards, and she told me I had to go out and get a fountain pen so that I could work with permanent ink. So I have literally switched over to permanent ink. It's the idea that my notes, my sketches, all of that stuff, by nature of the awards that I've been giving, it's like it's expected for me to create an archive of some sort. It's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird, right? Just the idea of having ink in your pen that doesn't fade over time and actually having to think that through has been the most bizarre situation. I am a massive introvert, and on the one hand can do the job of doing presentations and talks, but I certainly don't take myself terribly seriously at all. And just that switch to, of all things, fountain pens.
Well, you could make that a stipulation of your will. Keep the rest.
Oh gosh, I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, but I photograph myself a little bit more. I care a little bit more about my, I hate getting photographed, but ironically enough, but I do photograph myself a little bit more. I photograph my mom a lot more, you know. That's about it, I guess. That's, yeah. Karina?
Well, Deanna, I'm glad that you're writing in ink. That's awesome. You know, you are the person who should definitely like leave records. Like, that is important. That's good.
Isn't it crazy though? It's crazy. Yeah.
You know, I don't know, like a lot of the material that means a lot to me, maybe the people never imagined a future writer or a future reader. they maybe never imagined a future reader, but their documents are so valuable, so precious, you know. I think in our moments, we can never regard ourselves that way, right? We can't see that what we write now, or the photographs of us now, we can't imagine that they will be precious in the future. So, I mean, to answer the question, I do not have that eye on my life. Like, I don't archive things or save things or.
Stop that.
No, I mean.
So, like, as you had said, like my moving to ink, right? Like the manuscripts of the book that you produce and the research that you've done, all of that is a critical path in many ways. So that it would be the same as me and the documents and all the scribbles that I have about the genealogical and that kind of historical work. That stuff, yeah, I've definitely kind of switched things to Rubbermaid, watertight things and started thinking about those things. So, but your work, Karina, your archive matters just as much as anybody else's.
What I will say is I keep all my correspondence with writers. That I do archive all my emails, my correspondence, all of that with authors. I think that is interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't throw those things away.
But in the way that I would think about it is what kind of, you just refer to these writers that you find their work and you think of it as precious and as a gift. And so if you're thinking of like future archivists who come after you, the service that you're doing for them, that you're making their job just that little bit less arduous and that little bit less treacherous and that little bit easier. Are we all gonna get archived now?
Honestly, I've been on it. I do think a lot by nature of making film video and working with literally celluloid film and digital video. I think a lot about equipment obsolescence and thinking about how to migrate particular works onto solid state drives and stuff like that. That stuff, I have done a lot of research around how to archive that kind of material as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I keep a lot of, if it helps also on the flip side, I keep all of that old gear when talking about how to research.
Mm-hmm.
I have a Super 8 viewer, I have a 16 mil projector, I have a VCR. I don't have beta because who bought beta anyhow? But I keep up with the technology to be able to use these archival pieces that are out there in the world, right? And sometimes having, a quarter reel deck or something like that to be able to hear something that's been recorded onto a tape is fantastic,
Yeah. I've got one more question for you then. So there's a struggle to decolonize institutions and curatorial practice, even current struggles with the moves to decolonize. I'm curious if Deanna could extend her wonderings about how to beat down the doors of the institution and change things up. How do you see curatorial practices changing for the better? For the positive, sorry.
Hey, Crystal Mallory's out there. I know that. She's out there. My co-conspirator for the Black Drone show at Kitchener-Waterloo, which is like a fantastic project of archival intervention. I work best with curators that were artists or have an artist sensibility. And I think that has been one of the most precious experiences I've had. Crystal's an example of a curator that works like that. Having had an artistic practice prior to. And so her engagement is much more hands-on and emotionally committed. And I will have to admit, and she knows this, I've said this to her before, but she's also been the first Black curator I worked with. And so it was a whole different beast from any other kind of curatorial experience I've ever had. And we both were neck deep in the archive and trying to kind of parse through the conceptual and archival historical meanings of things. And I think together we created an extraordinary exhibition that I think is just it's the foundations of the beginning of the crack at the base of the monument, so to speak. Beautiful experience. I think that there are a lot more Black curators out there. Again, speaking to what Karina said before, a lot of women, a lot of Black women out there doing this work, doing this cultural history keeping work. And I think that we really need to put more energy into having that conversation. I have always been committed to working with women, smart women who have been holding it down forever anyhow. I just like working with them and bringing them to the forefront. So that's also a major piece. As far as breaking into the institutions for curation, working as an artist whose ambition is very much grounded in a political ambition to undo things. I work with co-conspirator curators who are willing to, one, get me in there to do what I do. So these days, my life has changed in that regard, where before I would literally have to sneak into an institution and do what I did. Now people seek me out to do what I do on purpose. And so now I'm working with curators who are, again, women that have been behind the scenes, holding it down mostly for older white men, quite honest, and who have been basically shadow running these organizations anyhow. And they know, even if they aren't at the forefront of it all, they know how the institution works, and they are willing to mess with all of the rules and work through the system to make change happen. It usually is to the surprise of other people around them, even if you're working with them on the day-to-day, right? So that's one thing I can say. That's awesome. Lots of Black women. I'm so happy of all these Black women curators that are out there. Speaking from Concordia University perspective, I'm teaching artists how to think like curators, and that too will shape the way the work is produced, and it'll at least shape the way that they understand how their work functions in the world. And that too, the curatorial, I think my Fantasyland curatorial position would be what Karina was talking about at the beginning. Working from a place of double consciousness would be an extraordinary shift for Black or Indigenous or any other racialized body within a system to get to the clarity about where you fit in the system. That is the very essence of how you start making change.
I sort of have a follow-on question to that one. That's not other people's mind, so I know this is cheating, but what do you think about, that there are, these Black curators and writers and thinkers out there, but if they're consistently locked into sort of temporary gigs, and if they come in and curate a show, it's on this sort of like temporary basis, that there are these like flashes of brilliance, but they're sort of like interspersed with a lot of same old. So what do you think about the need for that consistency of that culture production?
I Zoom and that mute button. Again, Crystal's out there and she can speak to the strength, the power of having been at the institution for over a decade and having an internal understanding of how the organization works, so that she knows also how to kind of maneuver around it. I think you need both. I see Justin's question around the periphery. I think it's a combination of outside agitation and inside mobilizers. I think it kind of has to be a bit of the two. I think speaking of two, I was telling Karina earlier about the Black hires that are happening at Concordia, and it's such an interesting thing, but that came about. That wasn't like somebody inside the institution said, hey, let's do this. It came about because of extraordinarily powerful public protests and demands from people outside of the institution for change. So I think it always has to be a combination of the two.
Okay. Well, let me read Justin's question. It says, as Black academics working in and within predominantly white settler colonial institutions, Could you speak to the need for increased rigor and sensitivity when researching and including the work of racialized artists? Do you believe that there has to be an increase within our artistic communities and institutions to recognize, admit, and learn from the harm that these institutions have caused? Or alternatively, do you think that this world building will continue to happen in the periphery? That's my question about the dark.
Look at you just turn that around. Okay. Karina, do you want to go?
Well, I'm not sure that my thoughts connect directly to Justin's good question, but as Nura and Deanna were speaking, I was thinking about the lack of Black archivists in Canada, and the implications then for how archives are created and how Black families' documents are handled or how they're viewed. But I'm of two minds of it, you know, like, so now I'm teaching students to do some research. One of the assignments in my current class that I'm teaching a course on Black Canadian literature. I've had students do a Black presences assignment, which means go out and research, choose a spot on this northern part of Turtle Island and research the Black history of the place. And then ask yourself how that changes things for you. Your sense of belonging or attachment to place or things like that. And one of the things that students are bumping up against frequently is, for instance, the search terms that you need to use to find historical Black presences. You need to type in Negro, you know, you need to, you know, to find material that was collected and tagged, et cetera, before 1980, you have to use these terms like, and that does something to you as a researcher, right? That really, it's hard, you know, you're entering really a colonial formation to find your materials, and that's can be really traumatizing, actually. So we need archivists that have some understanding of how to work with Black documents, how to organize Black documents, can communicate with the public, can communicate with Black families, for instance. We don't, I think, have that. On the other hand, perhaps Black families don't want to be a part of these archives. You know, perhaps Black families want to have their own institutions, right? So there's that tension, right? Do we decolonize these colonial institutions, or do we imagine something anew? And for the most part, Black people have just been hanging on to their own documents and not necessarily committing them to these public institutions of memory. And I have respect for that decision too. So I think that it's an ongoing conversation.
I'm a bit devil's, I'm of a gazillion different minds about it, right? I mean, obviously as a descendant, it's just a primary raw goal to have our stories in institutions. Some of the family members in our community have no desire to participate in it. It's not because they don't believe in the need for the history. They just don't want to produce or publish their own intimate histories, or the person that shared the history back in the day actually was a very shy person or something along those lines, right? On the other hand, and this is perhaps a distinction between a Black American context where there is a history of Black bodies outside of the institution and within the institution. Whereas in Canada, Black bodies are completely outside of the narrative altogether, and our erasure is almost complete in many ways, right? So we are certainly not in any museum context or in any kind of art historical institution in that regard. So the abs, I have some feelings about abandoning the ambition of being in the institution, because I appreciate the desire to not be in it, their families not wanting their archives to be in it, but we will never be able to write the history if people don't consent to offering that history in some regard or another. So it's a catch-22. The longer we kind of, as family members, hold on to this material, the longer it takes to create the history that we want to see, and the longer the clock continues to tick and the knowledge is lost, right? So there's that. I don't really have an answer to that because it is a catch-22. I know what my goal is, and other people might not feel like that. But also, I was going to mention something about the words you use to get into the archive to find Black bodies, and also, the willingness to enter into other realities around finding Black bodies, especially if it's an ethnically cleansed neighborhood, which could be anywhere, right? But finding it's not, Negro isn't even in the archive. The language that I was using in Southern Ontario was Darky. Other deeply problematic things that were less than human, and having, and that I think is something that is a knowledge that comes from being a Black scholar in the archive, of understanding all these other ways in which white archivists or white archives have been constructed and kind of shushed away material that they don't know what to do with, or they don't know how to rename, or it's got a troubling location like Nigger Rock or something like that, and people just kind of get apoplectic and just can't deal. And so you have to be able to kind of use that language to kind of extract that information as well, right? Or a particular history that was important for me was finding Sarah Pooley is her name. She was the former slave of Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, and she gave an oral history of her experience being enslaved by a Mohawk chief. And that was super important to discovering because it also is speaking to the Underground Railroad and all of those things, but it also opens up another conversation around how Black bodies came into Southern Ontario. She was stolen from the Deep South, sold to Joseph Brant in the United States, and he brought her across the border, and then ultimately through a different circumstance ended up selling her to a white family. But what matters about that story is that her story did not show up in any Indigenous archive that I was looking at. Her story was this Afro-Indigenous story was tucked into a Black slave oral history, and there was never an intersection with Indigenous archives, and so you wouldn't know to look for this Afro-Indigenous person over here, and you wouldn't necessarily look for her over there. And it's that understanding of the crevices between institutions and institutional ambitions or agendas. And you know that there are things and people that fall between the cracks just by nature of they don't fit within the systems that were created at the present. Yeah. That's why we need people in the archive that kind of have an understanding of these other experiences to do that work.
Right. Yeah, because that was what I was thinking when I was hearing this. That yeah, it's definitely one thing to be thinking that it's important that we get reinserted into those archives, but what if the archive still doesn't want you? What if you are willing to share your family stories and to place those things in the archive, but what if the archive is still, unsure about where you belong in or fit into that story of the archive, or, what if the archive still is supremacist, like that, that they can be this, mouthing of all the right things, but if actuality they're not willing to spend the money to go and collect all of these things, that doesn't mean that the archive doesn't want you. Oh, you just muted yourself. So I think you were you unmuted and then
I hate Zoom. I'm having other conversations. A good friend that I'm working with is Rochelle Dickinson, who is a co-curator of the Abadakwene show. That was this fantastic exhibition at the National Gallery of Indigenous Contemporary Work. And we were talking about the labor that went into getting that work into the institution and the problems with categorization. And sometimes Blackness doesn't make it into the institution because the institution is literally working with a database system that has no means to add them. And that was a lesson I learned about the national. It's like sometimes these decisions are made by nature of the outdatedness of the database or the programming or the cost of a major overhaul of an inclusive database that would open it up for other kinds of means of classification. There's also still the work of going in there and trying to homogenize the various different names and kind of get them into like a clarity of what the different words are for Black person are, by example. So it's and recognizing that there's generations of archivists that have flown through an institution and played their part with that archive, may or may not have left behind their notes about how they were doing what they were doing. Compound that over and over, and you've got a hot mess of a database that has so many hands in it that you don't even know how to kind of get it straight, so to speak. I would argue that that is the case for most of our cultural institutions, really. So that's also the other challenge. So we need folks going through library sciences to know how to crack these systems. That's the other. We need more Black librarians. Let's get real. Archivists, absolutely. Black teachers, Black technicians, Black everything. We need all of that stuff.
Do you think something that can be done by white archivists or non-Black archivists or non-Black librarians?
Yes, it can be done if there was, I think anybody would have to learn how to read the archive and then from there figure out how to make an order of it. I think if you're culturally sensitive, if you've done your research, there are all kinds of really great archivists that are out there that know that the system is fraud, right? There's a group called GLAM. If you go onto Wikipedia, there's an organization called GLAM, and it might be GLAM Archives or something along those lines, but it's an acronym for archivists around the world that are actually trying to do that job of I hate the word decolonize, but that thing of reorganizing and disseminating information and copyright cleared data on Wikipedia. So I found, by nature of that organization, extraordinary images of Black life in Amherstburg through the McCready archive at Ontario Archives. But the point of it all being that it was an archivist that was working on the back end that figured out a way to disseminate, to publish on Wikipedia. And that is another kind of thing that's happening. There are all these badass archivists that are trying to undo it too.
Yes. That is such a wonderful and hopeful note. I think that we are reaching the end of our time. There was so many amazing questions that were in the chat that we didn't unfortunately get time to get to, but it shows that a lot of people have been very paying attention to all the things that you're saying and are so excited about your work. So I know that Cassandra is going to be coming in recently to just close us out, but I want to just offer my deep and heartful thanks for you both for being here today, for your beauty and wisdom and tender souls, and for all the work that you do. I know that it's touched me personally and a lot of other people. So thank you.
Fantastic. The questions are so good, Joel. I'm so sorry I don't have another hour or two. They're good.
Yes.
Can we get a transcript of the questions? I'd be interested in sort of looking through these because while you're speaking, you can't look, but I would be wonderful. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. And you can find me. I'm easy to find. The email address is easy to find. So if you feel like you really need to know the answer to that question, just drop me a line. That's also cool too.
Great,
it was beautiful to be in conversation with you. Thank you both so much.
Indeed. Thank you, Karina. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, thank you three so much. This is Cassandra from the IKG, and on behalf of myself and the IKG and AU Arts, I just want to extend my heartfelt gratitude And thanks to Deanna and Karina for sharing your stories, your research, and your perspectives with us. And a huge thank you to Nura as well. We approached Nura with a very short timeline and a predetermined title for this talk. And where you went with it is, beyond important and incredibly inspiring. So thank you not only for moderating, but for organizing this talk and bringing this conversation to our community. And a last thank you to RBC Future Launch, and just for everyone who attended, thank you so much for tuning in. This talk has been recorded. So for AU Arts students, it'll be available on stream shortly, and for everyone else, it'll be on our website and on the AU Arts YouTube channel. And Karina, I'll look into getting a transcript. I don't really know how Zoom works at all, but I think we can get that.
You can download the chat, save the chat button.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we will do that.
Before you leave.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been waiting for the opportunity to be able to have a talk in Alberta about the work. It's finally happened, and so I'm so psyched about that. I do have a show coming up at Banff very soon, so that's also out there, but it's really special to be able to bring the story back about where the history of the research has gone and what it's doing. It's super important to bring it back to Alberta, so thank you. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.